There are people who have already made the decision, not loudly, not dramatically, no announcement, no declaration, no burning of bridges. Quietly, privately, in the space between one version of themselves and another, they stopped chasing the life they were supposed to want. And then something strange happened. They still felt wrong, not conflicted the way you feel when you're still choosing, not guilty the way you feel when you've done something you shouldn't have, something more disorienting than that. They felt wrong the way a language feels wrong when you've been speaking it for so long that you forgot you were translating. Not the panic of the wrong direction, the unease of the right one. Because here's what almost no one tells you about finally choosing yourself. The world doesn't stop sending the signal. You can opt out of the life everyone else is building. You can close the door on the career ladder, the packed calendar, the performance of perpetual enthusiasm. But the signal keeps coming. Through a family dinner, a casual conversation with an old friend, a Sunday afternoon scroll through other people's carefully curated lives. And every time it comes, something inside you flinches. Not because you want those things, but because you still feel like you should. This is the part almost no one explains, and it's the part that does the most quiet damage. Most conversations about this kind of life stop at the decision. They celebrate the clarity of knowing you don't want the standard script. They honor the courage of choosing differently, but they don't talk about what comes after, about the strange, persistent discomfort of living in alignment with yourself while still carrying the emotional residue of a world that never agreed. You made the right choice, and it still doesn't feel completely right. That gap between the life you chose and the ease you expected choosing it would bring is what we're here to sit with today. Because that gap is real. It's not a sign that you made the wrong decision. It's not evidence that you should go back. It's something much more specific, and understanding it changes everything. For people like this, people who love solitude, who need quiet, who have consciously stepped away from the life everyone else seems to want, the confusion isn't about the choice itself. It's about why the choice still has to be defended. Internally. Constantly. Long after the decision was made. You don't question whether you like spending a quiet evening alone more than a crowded party. You know that. You've always known it. What you question is whether that preference is allowed, whether it makes you less, whether the people who look at your life and see absence, less ambition, fewer connections, smaller circles, are somehow seeing more clearly than you are. The doubt isn't about the life, it's about the legitimacy of wanting it. And that kind of doubt is exhausting in a very particular way, because you can't resolve it by making a different choice. You've already made the right one. There's a specific quality to this exhaustion that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not the exhaustion of effort. It's the exhaustion of vigilance, of monitoring constantly how your chosen life appears to others, of bracing quietly for the comment at Christmas dinner, of pre-apologizing internally for a life that doesn't need to be apologized for. You're not tired from doing too much. You're tired from defending, silently and continuously, the right to do less. And the cruelest part is that this vigilance is invisible, even to you, much of the time. It lives below the level of conscious thought. It's just a low hum, always present, slightly below the surface of every ordinary day. What you're living with isn't decisional conflict. It's something Jung would recognize immediately. Jung spent decades studying what he called the collective unconscious, the deep, shared layer of human experience that shapes how we feel about ourselves before we ever have a conscious thought about it. He understood that we don't just absorb the values of our culture through education or instruction. We absorb them deeper than that, into the parts of ourselves that respond before we can reason, the parts that feel shame, wrongness, deficiency, not because we've thought our way to those feelings, but because they were installed before we knew they were being installed. This is what makes the feelings so difficult to argue with. You can't logic your way out of something that didn't arrive through logic. You can know intellectually that a quiet life is a valid life. You can understand, rationally, that needing solitude is not a failure. You can read every book and watch every video that confirms your way of being. And still, when someone looks at your Saturday evening, a book, a cup of tea, no plans, no company, and says, "Don't you get lonely?" Something inside you flinches, not because you're lonely, but because their question carries the weight of 1,000 cultural voices that agree with them. Jung called this the shadow. Everything the culture teaches us is unacceptable, and everything we learn very early to hide. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." For sensitive, introspective people who need solitude and don't want the standard life, the shadow often contains exactly that: the desire to be quiet, to want less, to need fewer people, to find meaning in ways that don't photograph well or announce themselves at dinner parties. The shadow isn't always dark, it's often just hidden. Parts of ourselves we've learned to keep out of the light because the light, at some point, didn't feel safe for them. You didn't decide those things were wrong, you absorbed that they were, and absorption goes deeper than decision, which is why you can decide your way out of the standard life, but not decide your way out of the feeling that it's still somehow required. The work isn't to make a better decision. The work is to reach the layer where the absorption happened, and slowly, patiently, with great gentleness, begin to undo it. Jung called this process individuation. Not becoming who you want to be, becoming who you actually are, which is a different thing entirely and a much harder one. If this is the kind of question you've been sitting with, not just, "What do I want?" but "Why does wanting it still feel like something I have to justify?" This channel is a quiet place where questions like that are taken seriously. You're welcome to stay. I remember the first time I understood this difference between deciding and integrating. I was sitting alone on a Tuesday afternoon, genuinely alone, genuinely content, reading something I loved with no plan to be anywhere else. The light was coming through the window at that particular angle that only happens in the late hours of a quiet day. The room was still. Everything felt, for a moment, exactly right. And without warning, a feeling moved through me that I recognized but couldn't quite name. Not loneliness, not regret. Something more like guilt without a clear object. As if being that content, that still, that sufficient in my own company was somehow a form of theft. As if I was taking something I hadn't earned. I sat with it for a long time, that feeling. And eventually I understood. I wasn't feeling guilty about the afternoon. I was feeling guilty about myself. About being someone who could feel that complete in so little. About needing so little from the world and from other people. The world had taught me, very carefully and over a very long time, that needing less was a kind of failure. That self-sufficiency, taken too far, was loneliness with better PR. That a person who could be genuinely happy alone on a Tuesday was a person who had given up on something, not a person who had found something. I had rejected the lesson consciously, but I was still living with the residue. That residue, that's what we're talking about. Not the choice, but the cost of having made it in a world that still insists it was wrong. Here's where most people completely misunderstand this experience. They assume the discomfort means something is unresolved, that you're secretly questioning your choice, or secretly wishing you were different, or secretly hoping someone will come along and give you permission to want more. But that's not what the discomfort is. The discomfort is the natural friction of living at the edge of what your culture considers legible. Because cultures have a narrow bandwidth of legible lives. Lives that make sense. Lives that can be explained at a dinner party, celebrated at a family gathering, validated by a LinkedIn profile. A life built around solitude, depth, intentional smallness, and the quiet pleasures that don't require witnesses. That life falls outside the bandwidth. Not because it's wrong, but because it's rare enough that the culture hasn't built a clear language for it. And humans are meaning-making creatures. When we can't find the language for what we're doing, we borrow the language that's available. And the available language says, If you're not building something visible, you must be retreating. If you're not expanding, you must be shrinking. If you're not performing, you must be hiding. You're doing none of those things, but you're living in a world that doesn't have better words for what you're actually doing. And that absence of language is its own kind of loneliness, a very specific one. The loneliness not of being without people, but of being without accurate reflection. Of moving through a world that keeps handing you a mirror that doesn't show your face correctly. After a while, you start to wonder if the mirror is right and your own sense of yourself is wrong. That wondering, that's the residue doing its work. If we go one layer deeper, something important appears. The feeling that your choices need justification, even when you've already made them, even when they're right for you, often has roots that go back much further than you realize. For many sensitive, introspective people, early life taught a particular equation: visibility equals worth. Not always through cruelty, sometimes through perfectly ordinary love that happened to express itself through external achievement. The parent who lit up at good grades but went quiet in the face of a child who simply wanted to read in their room. The teacher who noticed only the students who raised their hands. The social world of adolescence where belonging required a particular kind of performance. Loudness, enthusiasm, availability, the willingness to be constantly seen. You learned in those years that being quiet, interior, self-sufficient, that being most fully yourself, didn't generate the signals of worth that the world was rewarding. So you learned to doubt that self, to treat your own preferences as suspect, to view your natural way of being as something that needed correction, or at least apology. You became fluent in performing the version of yourself that the world could understand. And you became suspicious of the version that didn't need an audience. Jung understood this with particular clarity. He believed that what gets pushed into shadow doesn't disappear. It goes underground and exerts pressure from below. The parts of yourself you've learned to hide don't stop being real. They just stop being visible. And invisibility, over time, creates its own kind of suffering. The suffering of not being able to fully inhabit your own life, of always living slightly to the side of yourself, of feeling like the most authentic version of who you are is also somehow the least acceptable. Individuation, the slow return to yourself, isn't a single moment of arrival. It's a practice, a direction, the repeated patient choice to honor what's true in you, even when the culture insists otherwise. And that practice begins usually not with dramatic change, but with something quieter, the willingness to stop apologizing internally for what you actually need. Let's make some distinctions here, because this is where clarity lives. There is a difference between still integrating and being wrong. Still integrating means you've made the right choice, and your nervous system and emotional history haven't fully caught up yet. The discomfort is the lag, not the signal. It's the echo of old instructions in a life that has already moved past them. Being wrong means the discomfort is your deeper self trying to tell you that something is genuinely misaligned, that you're not choosing solitude freely, you're retreating from something you actually need, that what looks like a chosen quiet life is, at its root, a way of staying safe from something that frightens you. How do you tell the difference? Still integrating feels like quiet unease in the presence of other people's certainty, like flinching at signals you've already consciously decided to ignore. The life itself feels right. There's a settledness underneath the noise. The doubt is about the world's reaction, not about your own experience. Being wrong feels like grief, like absence, like something essential is missing, not something unnecessary is gone. There's a hollowness that solitude doesn't fill, a longing that more quiet doesn't answer. Both are real, both deserve attention, but they require very different responses. One asks for patience, the other asks for honesty. There is also a difference between internalizing shame and choosing quietly. Internalizing shame means living your chosen life while continuously monitoring how it looks to others, while pre-apologizing for its smallness, while shrinking the story you tell about it before anyone has a chance to respond. You're always slightly hunched around your own life, as if protecting it from criticism that may or may not be coming. Choosing quietly means living your chosen life without requiring anyone else to understand it, without needing their approval to feel legitimate, without the constant low hum of defense. You can describe what you've built simply, honestly, without apology, and let others make of it what they will. Most people who love solitude are somewhere on the spectrum between these two. The work, the real, patient work, is the slow movement from one toward the other. And there is a difference between waiting for the feeling of wrongness to go away and learning to carry it with less weight. The feeling, when it comes, probably won't disappear entirely. Not for a long time, maybe not ever. But it can become lighter, less convincing, more recognizable for what it is, an echo of an old instruction, not a reliable report on your current life. Schopenhauer understood something about this with unusual clarity. He believed that one of the greatest sources of human suffering is what he called the opinion of others, the invisible tribunal we carry inside us, judging our choices against standards we never consciously agreed to adopt. He wrote, "We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people." 3/4. Not a small concession, not a minor adjustment. The majority of who you are, quietly surrendered, not through dramatic sacrifice, but through the slow, daily erosion of choices made for an audience rather than for yourself. The career that looked right, the social commitments that seemed obligatory, the version of your needs you learned to shrink before presenting them so they would be easier for others to accept. All of it, 3/4 of yourself, offered up to the tribunal. And what Schopenhauer is pointing at isn't bitterness, it's arithmetic. If you've spent decades giving that much of yourself to the collective script, then the life you're building now, the quiet one, the deliberate one, the one that finally fits, isn't retreat. It's recovery, the reclamation of what was always yours. Because the feeling of wrongness, when you stay with it rather than flee it, eventually reveals its structure. And when you can see its structure, when you can say, "This is cultural residue, not inner truth," or "This is the lag of integration, not the signal of error," it loses some of its authority over you. You can feel it without believing it. And that, the ability to feel something without being fully governed by it, is one of the quieter forms of freedom available to a sensitive person. Not the freedom of not feeling, the freedom of feeling without being ruled. This isn't a sign that you're broken or that your chosen life is wrong. It's a sign that you're human enough to still carry what the world put in you, and conscious enough to know the difference between carrying it and being defined by it. Here is what you can do, gently, without forcing anything. It might mean noticing, without judgment, when the feeling of wrongness arrives. Not fighting it. Not immediately trying to reason it away. Just, there it is again. I recognize you. Naming the feeling takes some of its power. You can't argue with what you can't see clearly. It might mean asking, when the feeling comes, is this information or is this an echo? Information about your actual life, something genuinely misaligned that needs attention, or the echo of something you were taught long before you were old enough to question whether it was true. It might mean building small, private rituals that affirm your chosen life without requiring anyone else's witness. A morning that belongs entirely to you. An evening with a book and no performance. A walk taken not for fitness or productivity, but simply for the pleasure of moving through the world quietly, on your own terms. It might mean practicing the language of your own life, learning to describe what you've built without automatically framing it as a lack. I live simply, instead of, I don't have much. I value depth over breadth, instead of, I'm not very social. I protect my time carefully, instead of, I'm not good at keeping up with people. The language you use to describe your life, even to yourself, shapes how legitimate it feels. It might mean finding one other person, just one, who understands this from the inside, not to validate your choices, not to convince you you're right, but to remind you occasionally that the language for this life exists, that you're not alone in speaking it, that the quiet life you've built is recognizable, legible, even beautiful to someone who lives close to their own version of it. It might mean returning again and again to the moments that feel most true, not the moments that look best, not the moments that would explain well to someone else, the moments that feel like you, and letting those moments be the standard against which you measure your life, not anyone else's idea of what a life is supposed to look like. Imagine this, a version of your life, not far from now, where the feeling of wrongness still visits sometimes, where a family gathering still carries its familiar low-grade static, where someone's comment about your quiet life still lands with a small sting, but where those moments no longer have the power to make you doubt yourself. Because you've been accumulating something, slowly, the way you accumulate anything that matters. Not in dramatic gestures, but in small, repeated acts of choosing yourself. You've been building a life that fits, not one that photographs well or impresses easily or explains quickly at a party. One that, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, with light coming through the window at that particular late-day angle, feels like the only life that was ever actually yours. And from the inside of that life, the signal that once said you're wrong, you're lacking, you're missing something, it doesn't stop arriving, but it stops landing, because you've built something solid enough that the signal bounces off. Not because you've hardened, because you've rooted. You've stopped waiting for the world to catch up to you, to find the language for what you've chosen, to celebrate the life you've built. You've stopped needing it to. And that, not the absence of doubt, not the silence of the signal, but the steadiness you've grown underneath it, that is what integration actually feels like. Not peace as the absence of noise, peace as the presence of something stronger. But here's the question that lives just beneath this one, the one that comes next, once the steadiness begins to settle. What do you do with the parts of yourself that the quiet life doesn't reach? The parts that still want to be seen, known, witnessed, not by the world, but by someone who actually understands. That's a different kind of longing, one that doesn't disappear in solitude and doesn't dissolve in company either, one that unfolds in the next quiet conversation, alone together, a quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.